Oh, hi. Welcome to my bathroom. Anyways, my bathroom is also connected to these walk-in closets. See, I got one over here that's a his and a hers side over here. That's not for me. Now, about 2.5 years ago, we did a complete remodel of our entire master bedroom. You might recognize some of the things we made, like these floating side tables with built-in wireless chargers. And this cool bed with this upholstered headboard. Remember that one? Oh. Ah. This giant oak barn door. This cool hutch that I did not make. Craigslist. Bathroom vanity. This curved cabinet thing, remember that? That was tricky with the curved doors over here, and that was a reflection. You were looking in the mirror, you thought it was real, but it wasn't. But anyways, built that. But the one thing that I never got around to doing was our closets. I threw up some rods, we hung up some clothes, and that was 2.5 years ago. And my wife has been like, honey, can you please get the closets done? And I've been like, woman. No, actually, I don't talk to my wife that way or else I would not be sleeping in this room anymore. Anyways, I've been telling her for a while, I'll get the closets done. So in this video, I'm finally gonna do it. Closet organization on her side, closet organization on my side, and well, you're gonna follow along and see if we can actually successfully get another house project done. So check the links down below in the video description. There's a link to all the products we're gonna use. Also, if you're not signed up on Patreon, there's a link down there for Patreon where you can get a bunch of behind the scenes footage and backstage stuff. And yeah, you're missing out if you're not over on Patreon. So let's do this. With big cabinet jobs like these, I always like to sketch them up first. So I put them in SketchUp. This is gonna be my wife's side, got some drawers, got some cabinets. At the very back, there's this one cabinet unit with a butcher block top because, well, that's what she wanted. And then on my side, well, it's a little bit smaller than hers, but I'm still gonna jam pack it with drawers on both sides, upper cabinets, and then this little cutout where I'm gonna put a laundry hamper. Once I had all the cabinets and sizes and everything designed in SketchUp, the next thing I needed to do was make a cut list. And boy, is this a gigantic one. Look at all those individual pieces of plywood for 2 stinking closets. What the heck? Speaking of plywood, for this entire project, I'm going to be using pre-finished birch ply because I don't want to have to finish the inside of all these cabinets. So might as well do pre-finished, and then all I got to do is paint the outside. I don't even have to paint that much of the outside because they're all sandwiched in between walls. Anyways, with my cut list in hand, I realized that I could not use my table saw because all the plywood was stacked in the way and I couldn't move my fence. So I had to move every single sheet of 3/4 inch plywood before I could start cutting. But eventually I got it moved, I turned the table saw on, and away we go to cut all of our parts and pieces for our cabinet boxes. Now, when designing cabinets, try and make it as easy on yourself as possible. For example, with all of these cabinets, I made them the same depth, which means I could set my table saw to one setting and rip down a bunch of strips of ply. Then I can go back and cut my individual pieces from those strips depending on how tall each cabinet carcass is. Eventually I had all those pieces cut to the right width, and then I realized I couldn't move my table saw fence over to cut them to the right length. So once again, I'm gonna have to move every single one of these pieces of plywood out of the way before I can use my table saw. On top of that, I discovered that I only bought half the amount of plywood I actually needed. So what you see here is only half of what will be used for these cabinets. Eventually I got it all moved and it was time to start cutting pieces to length. Now I like to just cut these on the table saw, but I will warn you right now, this isn't the safest way to cut long pieces of plywood. I've been using the table saw for years and I feel very comfortable in doing it this way, but if you don't, then use a track saw. Because I don't want to be responsible for you getting a piece of kickback in your area. As I started cutting all of my different sized pieces, I would go over to my parts list and I would cross them out as I went to make sure that I got everything cut. I would also label each stack of pieces so I knew which pieces were which lengths. Now to hook these together, I'm going to be using a combination of dado grooves and rabbets, depending on which boxes I'm building. Basically, the dadoed groove is the same width as the plywood itself, so when I put a connecting bottom in between the two pieces, I can glue it in place right in that dado. So after cutting my first groove, I test fit a little scrap piece just to make sure it was a nice tight friction fit. And then I cut the remainder of my pieces. Now you'll see I'm doing a rabbet cut here, which means I'm going to use a sacrificial fence so that I can push the plywood all the way up to the fence and cut a 3/4 inch channel along the very edge of the plywood. While I was waiting for Craig to show up with more plywood, I started cutting down a bunch of strips. Now these are going to be used to kind of connect all of our cabinet pieces together just as little bracing strips. And to get the length on those, well, I kind of put my cabinets together and measured the distance in between them. That's going to be the length of my brace pieces, and that'll all make sense when I start assembling. So just wait, I'll explain it in a second. For now, I went over to my miter saw, I set up a stop block, and I cut down a bunch of those brace pieces, and then I added pocket holes to both ends of them so I could install them quick and easy with a little glue and a couple screws. By the time I was done with all that, Craig showed up with about 15 more sheets of plywood. We actually used 22 sheets of plywood in total for this project, which is insane when you think that it's just for 2 closet units. Now, if this wasn't in a closet, I actually could have used a lot less plywood, but I had to make a bunch of small boxes because that was the only way to fit them through the doors of the closet and get them installed with the low ceiling. So this is how our boxes are going to be constructed. Our upper boxes are going to have a rabbet on both ends, and the plywood is going to be flush on the top and bottom. Now our lower boxes are going to have this dadoed groove, which will bring the bottom up off the floor about 6 inches. And then we'll brace out the top of the lower boxes with just some strips of plywood, because the lower boxes are going to have drawers and you're not going to see inside of them. The upper boxes, however, are going to be open cabinets, so we need to add a 1/4 inch dadoed groove along the back side to hold our 1/4 inch plywood panel and make the insides of the cabinet all, nice and finished looking. After putting a 1/4 inch dado stack in my dado saw, I set the fence 3/4 of an inch away from the blade. That way I can fit my 3/4 inch brace pieces behind that panel. Again, this will all make sense when I start assembling the boxes. Then finally, after cutting that groove on all of the pieces that needed it, I just needed to cut down my 1/4 inch plywood to the right size and shape for my back panels. To assemble my boxes, I'm going to use a combination of these 1.5 inch long fasteners here, some pocket screws for my brace pieces, pocket screws, and a drill because I have to pre-drill everything out so I don't split the plywood. Before I start assembling, I moved everything into individual piles based on the boxes that needed to be assembled. This kept everything nice and organized. Then all I had to do was take all of my pieces and hook them together, and I would be on my way to beautiful closet bliss. Now I'm going to start on my lower cabinet construction. Basically, I add some glue to that dadoed groove and I stick in my bottom piece. Just like this. Make sure it's nice and seated into that groove. I tap it with a rubber mallet, not too hard because I don't want to split my plywood or damage the veneer. Once that is in place, I add some more glue to the top of that piece. And then this is kind of the precarious, tricky part. Then I have to put the other side on, making sure that that bottom fits into that dadoed groove and I don't drop the other side of it. So I take some of my brace pieces and I just wedge them in there to prop it up. With everything propped up and held in place, I pre-drill a couple holes and I add some 1.5 inch long fasteners, basically just to hold everything together until the glue dries. Once I have my fasteners in place on the top, I slide each corner off of my work table just a little bit to get access to the bottom side, where again I drill a little pilot hole and I sink in some 1.5 inch fasteners. Then I add a brace piece at the bottom, lost one, and I add 2 at that top corner, stacked on top of each other. one on the top, one on the back, and then I screw those together with some more 1.5" fasteners. Then I add one more brace piece towards the front of my cabinet, and my lower box is complete. Well, this one lower box of about 8 that I have to make. Now, I know it's hard to see because you're watching this through a YouTube video, but the construction of that box took me about 4.5 minutes. Here's a sped up version of the entire process. So you can really see once you have all your pieces cut, it's pretty quick and easy to assemble them all and get all your boxes put together. Every time I completed a box, I would pick it up and kind of set it in place. Not like really in place because this is still in my shop and not inside of our closets, but I kind of started to build the closets in my shop. You know, lay them out the way that they will be oriented once I get them in the closet, just so that I knew all the pieces were being built and I could kind of start to get an idea of what everything was going to look like. I also started looking at these pieces thinking there is no way in heck they're actually going to fit in those closets, but that's tomorrow Jason's problem.
Hey, it's the new year, which means Christmas is behind us and it's time for those New Year's resolutions. Which is why, no, mine isn't to get in shape and work out more. Nobody ever sticks to those. Mine is just to improve my daily routine with AG1, because that's actually realistic, it's easy to do and implement, and it tastes great. Wow, that looks heavy. The thing I like about AG1 is it's not only good for your body, but it's good for your mind as well, because it's got plant extracts, adaptogenic herbs, antioxidants, things that really support your mental clarity. Put you in a better mood. When they say working out puts you in a better mood, but that just looks like a lot of work. Does your gut ever feel a little funny after the holidays because you're eating all that crazy stuff? Well, mine does too. And the nice thing about AG1 is it's got probiotics and prebiotics, and it's got enzymes that help with your gut health, so it can kind of get things back on track, if you know what I mean. Poop. The other thing I love about AG1 is it's so insanely easy to take. You literally take 8 to 12 ounces of water, mix some of the AG1 powder in there, and drink it. And unlike other drinks that say they're good for you, this one actually tastes good. I would legitimately buy this and drink it just because I like the taste. So if you want a realistic goal that you can actually stick to this year, go to drinkag1.com/bourbonmoth. They're gonna give you $20 off when you subscribe. And because they're so cool, they're gonna give my entire community a free year's supply of their vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 free travel packets when you sign up. So click that link down there and get yourself some delicious AG1.
Now my lower cabinet boxes were constructed a little bit different because they're all gonna be drawers, which means you're never gonna see inside the carcass, so they don't have to be pretty. They don't need a back panel, they just need to be a box. But my upper cabinet boxes are not the same. You're gonna see inside those because those are gonna have cabinet doors, some of them are gonna have shelves, some of them are gonna have rods to hang clothes, so they do need to be pretty on the inside. So here's how I constructed the upper boxes. I did a rabbet on both ends right to the edge of the plywood, and then I stuck my top and bottom in place. I kind of held them square with these woodpecker square clampy things, just to make sure that, well, I mean, everything was square. That seems fairly obvious. I do one side, I'd hook that together with fasteners through the outside of the plywood, and then I would do the other side. Now, fasteners through the outside of the plywood is not always the best way to hook cabinets together. For example, if you're gonna see the outside of the cabinet box. But for these, no, you're not gonna see them. They're gonna be wedged in between walls, so screws from the outside it is. Once I had my top and bottom in place, I slid in that back panel into that 1/4 inch dado that we cut earlier, and then I put the top on with a little glue and a couple screws. And with that, we're almost done with the exception of a couple of brace pieces that I add to the back. Now this is why we set that dadoed groove 3/4 of an inch off the back, so that we could add these brace pieces on the top and bottom. These basically serve two functions. One is to help hold the box together, and two is to give a solid surface that is called a nailer strip that actually allows you to hook the cabinet box to the wall and make sure it's nice and secure. And this is what our upper boxes look like. And lucky for me, all of them are pretty much exactly the same size. So now I just gotta make about 12 of them. Oh goody. It wasn't easy. As I stood there at my workbench, hour after hour, watching the hands on the clock spin round and round, as if they weren't even aware that I was there, toiling, struggling, caught in what seemed like an eternal cycle. Build a box, place a box. Build a box, place a box. Build a box, well, you get the idea. Anyways, eventually, about 436 years later, I managed to get all those upper boxes done. The last and final thing I needed to do were these gigantic boxes that were neither upper or lower boxes because they went floor to ceiling. Now, I had to be very careful when I built these and make sure that I measured them at a diagonal and compared that to the ceiling height in the closet. Because if they're longer at a diagonal than the ceiling height, well, you're not going to be able to stand them up and put them in place. Now, believe me, I forgot to check this ahead of time before on other projects, and it's a real pain in the Once I had the gigantic back panel on these boxes slid in place, I added a few of those brace pieces. I did 3 on this one because it was so tall, it just seemed like it needed more than 2. I don't know, I just kind of did it. Not saying that you should, not saying that you shouldn't. I'm just stating the facts here. And after completing each one of these giant behemoths, I wrestled it off the table and into place. Before too long, I had all 3 of these floor-to-ceiling units constructed, and everything was laid out pretty much how it will be in the closet, and it was looking good. It took me about a day and a half to cut all of my parts out of full sheets of plywood and assemble them all and lay them out like this. I still can't believe that I used over 20 sheets of plywood for 2 closets. My arms were sore. Now that all the boxes were constructed, it was time to start working on face frames. But before I could do that, I really needed to secure all the pieces together so I could get accurate measurements for my face frames. To hook them all together, I'm just using some 1 1/4 screws. That way I can unscrew them into individual parts again when I need to carry them inside. Now, after doing these long floor-to-ceiling units, I realized that they were way too tall, like taller than they needed to be. So I decided to kind of change my design on the fly and add some drawers on the bottom of each one. I mean, there's still plenty of room on the top to hang long things, like her wedding dress that she has kept, but will never use again. It's just kind of sitting there as a decoration, but that's okay. We might need it someday, like when we have a granddaughter and she's really into early 2000s fashion. You know, she might want it. Anywho, once all of my boxes were hooked together and I added those drawers on the bottom, I could start cutting my pieces and laying out my face frames. Now, the first thing I do is cut my side pieces or my stiles. I clamp those in place. I take the measurements for my rails to connect the 2 stiles together. And then once I cut the rails, I add pocket holes on the ends of both the rails. That's the upper one and the lower one. And I glue and screw everything together into basically a giant frame. I'm not 100% positive, so don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that's why they call it a face frame. Once I have that giant rectangle/square screwed together, I carry the entire frame over to my cabinet just to double check and make sure that my measurements were right and everything still fits the way that it's supposed to. All right, moment of truth. Yeah. Don't you love how a face frame just instantly transformed the look of a cabinet? After I had the face frame in place and clamped so it wouldn't fall over, then I could start cutting all of my internal dividers and drawer pieces and make sure those all fit nice and snug. Now on the bottom, to divide out my drawers, the easiest way to do this is measure the distance between your outer stiles. Then you subtract the width of any internal dividers. I have 2 at 2 1/4, so that's 4.5 inches. So your total measurement minus 4.5 inches, and then you divide that amount by 3, and that gives you the space for each individual drawer. So I cut pieces to that space, and then just to double check that my math is right, because between you and me, it's not always right. I take those 3 pieces and I shove them at the bottom, and there should be a nice snug fit from left to right with no movement or wiggle room. When I'm happy with the fit, I take my little divider pieces over and I add pocket holes to both ends of those. And it's at this moment that I first realized these face frames are pretty big, and I took careful measurements to make sure that all of my boxes were small enough to fit inside my closet. But I never gave a second thought of whether or not these giant face frames would fit inside the closet. So I took a small break. I ran inside with my frame in a panic, and I started trying to fit it inside the door of the closet and stand it up into the right position. Now I have to remember these rods and all these clothes won't be in here, so I was pretty confident I could fit the face frame in my wife's side and get it stood up. But my side was a different story because, well, my face frames are a little wider than the ones that go on my wife's side. So with a little wiggling and angling and repositioning and cursing and sweating and then crying, I realized there is no way I'm going to be able to fit these face frames through the closet door and stand them up in the correct position. But that's okay. I just won't glue those ones together. I'll cut all my pieces, I'll do my pocket holes, I'll screw them together, and then when I take them inside, I'll just disassemble them, carry the individual parts into the closet, and then I'll just reassemble them in place and glue them together. I think. Anyways, I don't have to worry about that for my wife's side, so it was just full steam ahead, gluing and screwing everything together. Once I had the entire face frame assembled, I carried it all over to the carcass one more time, just to, triple check that it still fits. Like, the whole cabinet box didn't shrink or anything, which I'm happy to report it didn't. But gravity still exists, so watch out for that. Now I could take the time to show you all the footage of me assembling each individual face frame, but take my word for it, the assembly process is exactly the same. So I will spare you the wasted time of watching that and just show you each completed face frame going in front of the cabinet, because that's the most satisfying part. I mean, it goes from a raw cabinet box to a beautiful, unsanded poplar face framed box. Now, one thing that you might be interested in, but I'm not going to show you, are these shelves that I made for my closet unit. They just sit up here with shelf pins, and then, secret storage. How did he do that? Well, if you watched last week's video, you would know, and if you didn't, there's a little link up in the corner, so you can watch a video of the entire process of me making those secret storage compartments. And with that, all my cabinets were built and face framed.
Oh, hi! Now you're probably wondering why we're all of a sudden back in the bedroom and the cabinets seem to be installed and you didn't get to see any of that. Well, it's because I ran out of time and I'm gonna have to make this a 2-part video. And if I kept going and showed you the installation, well then part 2 wouldn't be long enough to really make a video. But in part 2, you're gonna see me struggle to get all these cabinet boxes up the stairs in the bedrooms, crammed into place. I'm gonna paint them, I'm gonna make doors, I'm gonna make drawer faces, and I got a few other little surprises to throw in there. So come back for our next video, part 2. Check that links down in the video description down there for all the tools and supplies we use. There's a link to our Patreon page down there. If you're not signed up on Patreon, you're really missing out. I'm telling you, that's where we're having fun. And it's kind of like a party. And we got a big community over there. We do weekly YouTube lives, behind the scenes footage, question and answers, all that stuff. So make sure you check out Patreon. Okay, goodbye.